Welcome to this video podcast series, The United Methodist Church, Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, produced by the Alabama West Florida Reconciling Ministry Network. I'm Dr. Sam Parks. In this episode, an impulse to include, we are looking back to yesterday and American Methodism's past to ask, how did we get here? And by here, I mean the point of schism in the United Methodist Church over whether LGBTQIA+ folk should be fully included in the life of the church. I didn't hear him say it, but someone once told me that Dr. Thomas Frank, my United Methodist polity professor, called the United Methodist Church the Chevrolet of churches. And by this, I assume he meant that of all the Christian denominations in the U.S., the Methodist Church has always tended to reflect the issues and interests of American culture in microcosm. Just as the U.S. has consistently redefined citizenship and who is included in the phrase, all men are created equal, so also Methodism has redefined the sorts of folks who qualify for membership and leadership in the church. And the stories of both nation and church could be told in following any number of issues, but we're choosing to tell the story of how we got here by focusing on the smallest common denominator, people. What sorts of people can be in the church, can represent their churches to the conference, can serve in leadership and be licensed or ordained into ministry and conference membership? And who can be appointed to serve as pastor of a local church? These are critical questions in American Methodism, and the answers to them have changed radically through the years. Every step of the way, American Methodism has become more inclusive of people over time, not less, and without alteration of our doctrines or articles of faith. And nearly every time, opponents of inclusion have used the Bible to make their argument, but then eventually wound up yielding their position. So let's begin at our foundations, the Wesleyan movement in Great Britain, because it is there that the story of inclusion truly begins. The theological impulse of Methodism from its inception was inclusive, mainly because it was egalitarian. In the early 18th century, this sort of hyper-Calvinism had been misused to justify the class system in Britain and maintain social and economic inequality. You're poor? Well, must be God's will. Oh, you were born into a coal mining family. You must be divinely destined for that work. You see, one's place in the world and the problems within society at large were often accepted passively as being part of the sovereign will of God. The poor of England were spiraling out of control. Gin and prostitution, violence, the slave trade, and appalling corruption in the church and government created one of the worst urban environments Europe had ever seen. Nevertheless, John Wesley gave the lowest class in England dignity, honoring them as the children of God. He preached that all may be saved, and that grace was available to all. And all meant all. Wesley embraced the radical equality that his Arminianism taught, and thus he embraced people in every station and place in the culture of his day. This theology of universally available salvation gave people hope and energy to change their lives and take responsibility for their own fate. They were no longer forced to see themselves as helpless victims of a divinely inspired plot to keep them poor. All that was required to become a member of the United Societies was, quote, a desire to flee from the wrath to come and to be saved from their sins. And that's it. Anyone could become a member of the Methodist movement, and they did. Not to say that there were no requirements for continuing membership, however, as Mr. Wesley's general rules prescribed the fruitful life. But who could preach in the first United Societies? Wesley styled his preachers in various ways, helpers and assistants, but the most telling of his titles for them was sons in the gospel. Wesley's preachers did not have to have seminary training or theological degrees. They were simply people of spiritual experience who simply had the gifts and graces for the work in Wesley's sight and were willing to learn from him. And they were all men. Wesley did appoint many women as class leaders, and encourage them to lead in prayer. And after all, more women than men joined the Methodist movement. Wesley was initially opposed to women preaching, but he eventually evolved on the issue and did license some women to preach, but never allowed them to itinerate on the circuits. But it cannot be ignored that the Methodist movement provided women significant leadership opportunities in comparison to many other traditions. Is it any wonder that a church founded soon after a revolution, throwing off the tyranny of a monarchy, would find its first schism prompted by a revolt over the unquestioned authority of bishops? The Methodist Episcopal Church, established at the 1784 Christmas Conference in Baltimore, continued Wesley's practice of clergy dominance of the church. The Methodist Conference was a connection of clergy, a fact that received almost instant opposition in America from the beginning. Protest against the absolute authority of bishops and the exclusion of laymen, yes, that's right, laymen, from the councils of the church grew with every meeting. Eventually, the Methodist Protestant Church broke away from the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1828. Their motto, a church without a bishop and a land without a king. The Methodist Protestant Church began to include laity, laymen, as part of the annual conference, establishing the pattern of sending one lay member to annual conference for every appointed clergy. Neither the Methodist Episcopal Church nor the ME Church South did this for decades. In 1939, at the Union of Methodism's three branches, the inclusive Methodist Protestant Church practice of lay membership in annual conference became the norm. Nevertheless, it was not until 1976 that the Book of Discipline would mandate that a number of laity equal to the number of clergy, including retirees, should be members. Who can participate in church governance? Any member of the church can. Here is one example of that inclusive impulse in the early days of American Methodism that is rejected by the majority, but comes to be the dominant impulse and an important part of our polity, practice, and discipline. Today, we look back and ask, how could we have not allowed laity to be part of our governance? Every step of the way, American Methodism has become more inclusive of people over time, not less. As I noted earlier, Mr. Wesley evolved a bit on the issue of women in ministry, granting some licenses to preach to women who were effective in the work in the last decades of the 18th century. But he was immensely encouraging to women in lay roles, such as class leaders and prayer leadership. His mother Susanna's forceful leadership at home and in church surely informed his thinking here. Mr. Wesley had a deep appreciation for the leadership capacities of women, even if these gifts were not formally certified until 1771, when he licensed Sarah Crosby and Mary Boscanet to preach. On the American side, pietist experiences of Methodist religion, well, they empowered women like Barbara Heck to lead faith communities. But formal leadership opportunities for women in the American church became fewer. Women held the office of class leader only briefly and sporadically. So women who did experience calls to preach had to find creative ways to exercise that call. The years of the Civil War found women assuming much greater roles in their churches and communities as the men were all off in the military. Women often had to manage businesses and large organizations and farming operations, and they gained more and more interest in community affairs and politics. They created and administered relief organizations during and after the war, and the years following saw women's missionary societies in all of the Methodist branches, North and South, English and German, black and white, establishing orphanages and rest homes for the aged, and women also developed home and foreign missionary societies. In 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded largely by Methodist women, such as Frances Willard, and soon became the nation's largest women's organization. It was predicated upon a social analysis that saw drunkenness and alcoholism, saloons, and the liquor industry as the determinant factors in crime, abuse, poverty, unemployment, and corruption. And it capitalized on long-standing Methodist commitments to temperance. Gradually, the WCTU pursued grander social reforms that would not succeed without votes, specifically the votes of the people most affected by those reforms, women. Thus, the WCTU became the birthplace of the American suffrage movement. Francis also believed strongly that women should be in the pulpit. So the WCTU became an advocate for the inclusion of women into full clergy rights in the Methodist Episcopal Church. The Boston University School of Theology had the practice of accepting women into its divinity degree programs. In 1876, Anna Oliver became the first woman to graduate from a Methodist seminary at Boston University. In spite of her excellence in local church ministry, her conference and bishop repeatedly blocked her ordination. Also refused that year was Anna Howard Shaw, who had been licensed and serving a church on Cape Cod for 6 years and made the highest score that year on the ordination exam. She moved to the Methodist Protestant Church and was ordained by the New York Conference in 1880, in secret, the day after the men had been ordained. In 1939, when the three branches of Methodism merged, Methodist Protestant women were no longer granted ordination rights. At every moment, from Wesley's day to our own, 2 verses from Paul's epistles have stood in the way of women preaching in Methodism. 1 Corinthians 14:34, women should be silent in the churches, for they are not permitted to speak, but should be subordinate, as the law also says. And then 1 Timothy 2:12, I permit no woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She is to keep silent. Women in nearly every generation of Methodism wrote powerful and eloquent defenses of women preaching, refuting these verses and finding so much more warrant for women doing this work in many other places in the Bible. And yet, it was not until April 1956 that the General Conference of the Methodist Church granted full clergy rights to women. And on May the 18th that year, Maud Jensen became the first woman admitted into full conference membership in the Central Pennsylvania Conference. Today we look back and ask, how could we have not allowed women to be equal partners in mission and ministry? Every step of the way, American Methodism has become more inclusive of people over time, not less. Without doubt, Mr. Wesley was a leading advocate for the abolition of slavery in the New World. But for 150 years before Wesley, the complete ownership of other human beings along with all of their descendants, known as chattel slavery, had become a well-established American institution in the South. During their ministry days in the New World earlier in their careers, John and Charles Wesley got to experience firsthand the atrocities and abuse suffered by black bodies. John's tract Thoughts Upon Slavery, first published in 1774, is thought by some to be the most strident and forceful set of arguments for abolition in its day. In this tract, Wesley argues that slavery is the result of greed and that the need for inexpensive labor in the Americas was really the only reason for it. He refutes the trope that slaves are actually rescued from more harsh conditions on the African continent and that slavery is actually an improvement in their lives. And he describes the horrors of the forced transport of Africans to the New World in chains on ships, and the beatings, rapes, forced separations of husbands and wives and parents and children that black Africans would endure if they survived it. 10 years later, the Christmas Conference of 1784 in Baltimore would witness a racially integrated gathering with leading black preachers Harry Hoosier and Richard Allen participating in the conference. The conference minutes in those days took a question and answer form, and after much of their routine business was complete, the question is asked, what methods can we take to extirpate slavery? The answer is a clear and ringing denunciation of slavery. We view it as contrary to the golden law of God, on which hang all the law and the prophets, and the inalienable rights of mankind, as well as every principle of the Revolution, to hold in the deepest debasement, in a more abject slavery than is perhaps to be found in any part of the world except America, so many souls that are all capable of the image of God. The conference then required every Methodist minister to emancipate their slaves within a year. But the pushback from Southerners was so strong that the next year that language was watered down, allowing that the rules were to be applied only so far as they were consistent with the laws of the state. By 1808, all language about abolition had disappeared from the Book of Discipline. This, along with much immoral and racist treatment, inevitably led to the exodus of many black people from the Methodist Episcopal Church to form their own denominations. Richard Allen and Absalom Jones led the black membership of St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia out to establish their own church. And in 1816, the African Methodist Episcopal Church was established as its own denomination, with Allen elected as its first bishop. In 1821, the AME Zion Church was similarly organized in New York. The ensuing decades would witness the gradual spiraling downward of the ME Church towards schism. The northern churches brought resolution after resolution demanding the abolition of slavery among Methodists, and at the General Conference of 1844, Bishop James Andrew, a slave owner, was suspended from exercising his office until he had given up his slaves. The Southern delegates were appalled at what they considered a massive overreach of the conference, and they left the ME Church to establish the ME Church South. What is so hard for us to understand today is that in the antebellum U.S., the Scripture's defense of slavery was viewed by many as the much stronger biblical argument to be made over the biblical attacks on the institution. On almost every page of the Bible, slavery is assumed to be permissible in some form. Many religious leaders felt that a common sense reading of the text would tell anyone that God does not oppose it. The far harder biblical argument was that God opposed slavery and even much less would abolish it. It took a war for the theology of abolition to be reflected in the law of our land and in our Constitution. Following the Civil War, the congregations of former slaves within the ME Church South were encouraged to form their own separate denomination, and in 1870 the colored, now Christian Methodist Episcopal Church was formed. But not a few black members and churches remained in the three majority white branches of Methodism. For almost 100 years, this north-south schism held, and in 1939, after several false starts, three branches of Methodism chose to unite. But the union raised the question as to how to deal with merging black and white churches into a single structure. Dr. William McLean quotes John Graham as saying, "The Negro became the sacrificial lamb on the altar in order that union could be consummated." And the form that altar took was the creation of a system of 6 U.S. jurisdictions, 5 geographic and 1 racial. All black churches and clergy were segregated into the central jurisdiction regardless of location, and where the election of bishops had formerly been a function of the General Conference, that power was now vested in the Jurisdictional Conference and was nearly its sole task. Bishops elected in one jurisdiction were only permitted to exercise episcopal authority within the bounds of the jurisdiction that elected them. This would ensure that the southeastern jurisdiction would not have to elect black bishops or whites sympathetic to the cause of racial integration, and no bishop elected elsewhere could take any authority in the southeastern jurisdiction. While provisions were made for equal black participation at the General Conference, black people were to be segregated at every connectional level of the church's life below that of the national structure. The 1954 decision by the U.S. Supreme Court outlawing segregation in public education and the ensuing movements for civil rights and voting rights for black people applied more pressure than the Methodist Church could bear, with several plans being raised for the dissolution of the central jurisdiction. The church then settling upon the 68 union with the Evangelical United Brethren as the right time. Interestingly, after the 1966 General Conference, every individual annual conference had to approve the plan of union of the General Church, as well as devise a plan to merge the white Methodist EUB and Central Jurisdiction conferences into a single annual conference where all churches and pastors would be on equal footing. They were required to do so before the 1972 General Conference when merger was mandated. Well, ending segregation certainly doesn't create integration or reconciliation or restoration. There are still churches that would not accept a black pastor or a female pastor, for that matter, into their church, which is painful and unjust to the black and brown bodies throughout the church, making it difficult to attract and retain clergy of color. Still, today we can look back and ask, how could we have not allowed black people full membership and equal leadership opportunity at any time in our past? The march toward full inclusion must continue on, and we must ask why the full inclusion of black people isn't more complete now. American Methodism has become more inclusive of people over time and not less. But sometimes what we say we believe about inclusion and how we actually practice what we believe are not the same. And that severely compromises our integrity and damages our ability to make disciples for Jesus Christ. There's a whole interesting history here about divorce in the Methodist Church, and I'll have a bit more about this in the script and notes that we plan to share with you. Suffice it to say right now that just like the rest of the culture in the U.S., a huge shift in thinking about divorce and the stigma it carries has occurred in the last century. Here are a couple of highlights. Nothing about divorce is mentioned in any book of discipline before 1884. And soon thereafter, all of the predecessor denominations start talking about it. It's viewed as unlawful, and no divorced person can marry except in the case of being the victim of an adulterous spouse. Over time, this gradually changes, and the church begins to see the value of taking a less legalistic and more therapeutic approach to divorce for the whole family. Today, the Book of Discipline says divorce is a regrettable alternative in the midst of brokenness, and it deserves our grief, but not our judgment. Divorced people, including clergy, can remarry now without consequence. But what I really want you to see is how similar to divorce, homosexuality is being treated by the General Conference, and I'm thankful for Darrell Stevens for pointing this out. The first mention about divorce, as I said, is in 1884. First mention of homosexuality is 1972. The first mention is placed in both cases in a non-binding area of the discipline. In 1884, it's in a section called the Special Advice. And in the case of homosexuality, of course, it's placed in the Social Principles. Then, both are subsequently moved to that part of the discipline specifying unauthorized conduct of a pastor. Both of the bans are considered absolute, allowing no room for discernment or exception, and both are repeatedly challenged by annual conferences and individuals who disagreed with the discipline. As interpretation of the Bible has changed as the culture has changed, every step of the way, American Methodism has become more inclusive of people over time, not less. Here are 4 ways in which Methodism has grown in its definitions of who can participate, who can lead, who can preach and perform the sacraments, and who can marry and be married. We could also easily include Native Americans and Hispanic people and many others in our inclusion roll call. And most of the time, the opponents of inclusion have used Scripture as the basis of their arguments, and time and again, the interpretation of Scripture simply changed by some combination of the force of war, the force of logic, or the force of culture. But one thing has not changed at all. None, not a whit. Our doctrine has not changed. The restrictive rules of our church in the Constitution have stood long years of time protecting our doctrinal standards. Our beliefs about God and Jesus Christ and the state of humanity and the scripture way of salvation, none of these have been in the least altered or affected by including more people. For nearly 200 years, the opponents of inclusion have promised that laity or women or black people, divorced people, and others would be like doctrinal Trojan horses that would at best water down our faith or at worst rip our faith from its biblical, theological, Methodist hinges. But they are wrong. The creeds are all still there. The essentials of the faith that we share with others in Christendom, all still there. And those beliefs that distinguish us as Methodist Christians, grace upon grace, the need for holiness of heart and life, heartwarming experiences of salvation, and the practice of spiritual disciplines, all still there for us, in us. Whether we are lay or clergy, no matter our gender identity or expression, regardless of our skin color or our marital status or the person that we love. The true way, the scriptural way, the Methodist way is still our way. As Mr. Wesley told us, grace for all, grace in all. The reconcilers of our conference just happen to believe that our holy God, once again, is renewing the church with the inevitable inclusion of our LGBTQ siblings, and that not too long from now, we will look at one another and ask, how could we have ever excluded these beautiful people from any ministry of the church? And we will see just how much richer we are for the gifts of their presence and leadership, and we will once again affirm that every step of the way, American Methodism has become imperfectly, but certainly, more inclusive of people over time and not less. That is our hope for the church, and that is our hope for you.